Iran just called this a full-scale war. Here's what's actually verified. This week, Iran's own president stood in front of his country's top judges and said the words full-scale war out loud. Within days, a second critical oil route, one connecting the Red Sea to nearly a quarter of the world's oil supply, was formally threatened with closure. Meanwhile, online, claims are spreading that Iran is about to invade Kuwait and that entire countries could disappear from the map. Some of that is verified, some of it isn't. By the end of this documentary, you'll know exactly which is which, and why the next 72 hours matter more than any single headline circulating right now. If you want this war explained with verified facts instead of amplified claims, subscribe. This story is moving fast. 4 months ago, most people outside the region would have struggled to place Bab el-Mandeb on a map. This week, that narrow strip of water may determine how much you pay for gasoline. This war did not start this week, and understanding why matters more than any single day's headlines. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a joint strike campaign against Iran, escalating a confrontation that had already run through a 12-day war in June 2025 and years of proxy conflict before that. What we are watching now, in the third week of July, is not a new war. It is the same war reaching a new and more dangerous phase, one where Iran's president has publicly used the words full-scale war, where a second maritime choke point has just been threatened with closure, and where credible, on-the-record voices are discussing the possibility of an Iranian ground operation against a Gulf state that, until recently, was not considered a direct combatant. Let's start with what is actually confirmed, because in a story with this many moving parts and this much competing claim-making, establishing a solid factual floor matters more than usual. On July 20th, 2026, Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian told a session of his country's Supreme Judicial Council that, in his words, Iran is engaged in a full-scale war with the United States. A war, he said, that now extends beyond missiles into Iran's economy and daily life. This is a verified, on-the-record statement, not a rumor. It came after 9 consecutive nights of U.S. strikes against Iranian targets, part of a campaign that has expanded from military and nuclear-linked sites in the south of the country to targets in Iran's center and northwest. Iran's health ministry has reported deaths from these strikes, including in the city of Tabriz. Iran's own economy is buckling under the strain. Inflation accelerated sharply through June, and independent reporting places year-on-year price growth at close to 90%. Why did this happen? And why is it escalating specifically now? The honest, high-confidence answer involves grief and legitimacy as much as strategy. Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, died, and his funeral in early July became an unexpected window into how fractured Iran's own leadership has become under the pressure of this war. Mourners at that funeral were captured on camera shouting, "Death to the compromiser," at President Pezeshkian himself, while Iran's top diplomat, Abbas Araghchi, the man who negotiated an earlier ceasefire with the Trump administration, reportedly had to flee the funeral after being pelted with rocks and accused of being a traitorous sellout. What does this reveal? It reveals a leadership under genuine internal pressure from hardline factions who view any negotiated de-escalation as betrayal, which helps explain why Tehran's rhetoric has hardened even as its military position, by most independent assessments, continues to weaken under sustained American strikes. This is a moderate to high confidence assessment, grounded in on-the-record reporting from the funeral itself rather than speculation. Now to the specific flashpoint your transcript raised: Kuwait. Is Iran actually preparing a ground invasion? Here the honest answer requires real precision, because this is exactly the kind of claim that has spread furthest while remaining least confirmed. What is verified? Footage has circulated showing Iranian military transport vehicles, including armor, moving toward Iran's western border region. What is also verified? Prominent, named Iranian commentators, including a regime-aligned academic and at least one former Iranian foreign minister, have publicly and explicitly discussed a ground incursion into Kuwait aimed at seizing specific American installations, naming Camp Bubiyan, Camp Arifjan, and Ali al-Salem Air Base as potential objectives. What is not verified, as of this recording, any official Iranian order to launch such an invasion, or any confirmed movement of Iranian ground forces actually crossing into Kuwaiti territory. Independent monitors covering this story explicitly flag this distinction, that influential Iranian voices are, in the words of one open-source analysis, saying the quiet part out loud, without that rhetoric yet translating into a confirmed operational order. This is a genuinely important distinction, not a technicality. There is a meaningful difference between a state considering an option publicly through aligned commentators and a state executing that option, and conflating the two overstates what we actually know at this moment. What we do know for certain about Kuwait is already serious enough without exaggeration. Since this war's opening days in late February, Iran has repeatedly struck Kuwaiti targets, including Kuwait International Airport's terminals and air traffic control infrastructure, an electrical substation that caught fire from drone debris, and, tragically, a residential area where a child died after drone wreckage fell nearby. In May, Kuwaiti forces intercepted an armed Iranian infiltration team attempting to reach Bubiyan Island near the Iraqi frontier, capturing several operatives in a firefight that wounded a Kuwaiti soldier, a genuine, confirmed cross-border incident, even if it fell well short of a full invasion. Kuwait's own government has been unambiguous in its public statements. Its emir has said the country faces an unprovoked attack from a neighboring state it considers a friend and to which it never granted permission to stage military action. Let's turn to the second choke point, because this is where the economic dimension of this war becomes impossible to separate from the military one. The Strait of Hormuz has been effectively disrupted since the war's opening days, forcing Saudi Arabia to reroute a large share of its crude exports westward through the Red Sea port of Yanbu instead, shipments that reportedly quadrupled in volume as the alternative route absorbed the pressure. On July 20th, Yemen's Houthi movement, long backed by Iran, formally declared a maritime blockade against Saudi Arabia, invoking what its spokesperson called an eye for an eye logic, tied to a dispute over a strike on Sana's airport days earlier. Independent energy analysts note that a genuine closure of Bab el-Mandeb, layered on top of the already disrupted Strait of Hormuz, could remove roughly a quarter of global oil and gas flows from normal shipping routes. A figure that explains why Brent crude has posted some of its sharpest single-day gains in years as this news broke. It remains uncertain, and reasonable analysts disagree on whether the Houthis possess the sustained naval capability to enforce a genuine blockade rather than an intermittent campaign of missile and drone harassment. But even the credible threat of disruption is already reshaping insurance costs and shipping decisions across the region. Now let's examine the claim about Jordan, because this is where verified fact and inflated framing sit closest together. It is true and independently confirmed through satellite imagery reviewed by international outlets that Iranian strikes early in this war damaged a thought-associated radar system at Jordan's Muwafaq Salti Air Base, a real degradation of the layered air defense network the United States has built across its Gulf and Levant basing network over the past 2 decades. It is also true that Jordan has intercepted the substantial majority of projectiles fired toward its airspace across multiple incidents since February, with Jordanian officials repeatedly stating that incoming missiles were intercepted with no casualties or significant damage. Framing this as Israel's last line of defense having been destroyed overstates a real and important development into something more absolute than the evidence supports. What has actually happened is a documented, partial degradation of regional radar and interceptor infrastructure across multiple host nations, Jordan, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, that collectively thins the layered defense network protecting the region without any single confirmed event that eliminates Israel's own substantial, domestically controlled air defense capability, which remains a separate and considerably more robust system than the shared regional network being described. This distinction matters enormously for how you should weigh the most dramatic claim in this entire story, the suggestion, attributed to a named former American intelligence analyst, that continued escalation could result in the disappearance of small Gulf states or even threaten Israel's continued existence. This is, by any reasonable standard, a low-confidence, speculative forecast, rather than an assessment grounded in current battlefield trajectory. Small Gulf monarchies have absorbed real, painful, and repeated strikes throughout this war without losing territorial control or political sovereignty. And Israel's air defense architecture, while genuinely strained by the broader regional disruption described above, has not been shown by any verified reporting to have collapsed or approached collapse. Repeating a dramatic worst-case prediction from a single-named commentator as though it were an emerging consensus assessment is precisely the kind of claim inflation this documentary is built to avoid. The honest position is that this remains one analyst's speculative scenario, not a documented trajectory. Let's apply systems thinking to trace how all of this connects. At the immediate military level, the layered American-built air defense network across Gulf host nations is being degraded piece by piece, radar by radar, interceptor by interceptor, in a campaign that is slow and attritional rather than a single decisive blow. At the political level, Iran's leadership is managing severe internal legitimacy pressure from hardline factions even as it escalates externally, a combination that historically makes de-escalation harder, not easier, since backing down now would hand ammunition to the very domestic critics accusing the government of weakness. At the economic level, the near-simultaneous disruption of Hormuz and the threatened disruption of Bab el-Mandeb represents an attempt, whether by design or by convergent pressure from Iran and its aligned Houthi partners, to impose the same kind of economic strain on Saudi Arabia and the broader Gulf that sanctions and strikes have imposed on Iran itself. At the regional level, host nations like Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Jordan face a genuine strategic dilemma. Each continues to absorb direct retaliatory strikes intended for a much larger adversary, the United States, purely as a consequence of hosting American forces, forcing uncomfortable domestic conversations about whether that hosting arrangement remains worth its cost. And at the long-term global level, sustained multi-front missile expenditure against these interceptor networks is drawing down finite stockpiles of Patriot and THAAD-associated munitions faster than current. Limited production lines can replace them. A resource constraint that could shape the war's trajectory as much as any single battlefield decision. Let's now red team the dominant narrative, because it would be irresponsible not to. An alternative explanation worth taking seriously. Much of the most dramatic escalatory rhetoric, from Iranian commentators discussing a Kuwait invasion to speculative predictions about Gulf states or Israel disappearing, may be serving an information warfare purpose distinct from actual operational planning. Regimes and aligned commentators under severe military pressure have a well-documented incentive to project maximum resolve and capability precisely when their actual position is weakening, both to deter further American escalation and to manage domestic audiences who might otherwise perceive negotiation as surrender. This does not mean the underlying military developments, the strikes on Kuwait, the Houthi blockade declaration, the radar damage in Jordan, are fabricated. They are independently verified. It means the most extreme interpretive claims layered on top of those verified events deserve to be held to a higher evidentiary standard before being repeated as likely outcomes. It's also worth engaging the historical parallel carefully. Some commentary compares this unfolding crisis to the build-up toward the 1991 Gulf War, when a smaller Gulf state's sovereignty became the flashpoint for a much larger multinational confrontation. The parallel has real resonance. A small, oil-relevant Gulf state again finds itself caught between a regional power and American forces stationed on its soil. But the differences are just as important. In 1991, the triggering event was an actual, confirmed ground invasion of Kuwaiti territory that had already occurred before the international response began. In the current situation, as of this recording, that specific triggering event, a confirmed Iranian ground invasion of Kuwait, has not occurred. What exists instead is a documented pattern of aerial and drone strikes, a foiled infiltration attempt, an open rhetorical discussion of a ground option, which is a meaningfully different and less advanced stage of escalation than the 1991 parallel implies. So where does this leave the region in the days immediately ahead? In the best-case scenario, the mediation efforts already underway from Qatari and Pakistani intermediaries succeed in producing a ceasefire framework before the Houthi blockade or any Kuwait escalation becomes irreversible, allowing shipping through both Hormuz and Bab el-Mandeb to gradually normalize. In the most likely scenario, based on the pattern of the past several months, the current attritional exchange continues largely along its existing lines. Periodic Iranian strikes on Gulf host nations, continued American strikes on Iranian infrastructure, and an unresolved simmering blockade threat in the Red Sea without a single decisive event resolving the conflict in either direction. In the worst-case scenario, a confirmed Iranian cross-border ground operation against Kuwait, even a limited one aimed narrowly at symbolic American targets, would represent a genuine, verified escalation on the scale of the 1991 parallel, likely triggering a much broader multinational response given Kuwait's status as a long-standing American partner. And in the wildcard scenario, worth naming precisely because it receives less attention than the dramatic invasion talk, a depletion of interceptor stockpiles across the region. Not a single dramatic battle, but simply running out of Patriot and the AD munitions faster than they can be replaced, could force a sudden, unplanned shift in how host nations and the United States manage this war, regardless of what either side's stated intentions are. None of these outcomes is guaranteed, and presenting any single one as inevitable would be a disservice to a story this genuinely uncertain. What can be said with confidence is this: a war that many outside the region assumed had been resolved by American strikes months ago is instead entering a wider, more economically consequential phase, spreading from a single strait to a second one, from direct strikes on Iran to strikes across half a dozen host nations, and from a purely military confrontation into an internal Iranian political crisis over legitimacy that may shape Tehran's decisions as much as anything happening on the battlefield itself. So, here's the question worth sitting with. Given that Iran's president has now formally used the words full-scale war, that a second major oil choke point has just been threatened with closure, and that credible voices are discussing a ground option against a Gulf state for the first time in this conflict, what do you think is more likely to define the next 24 to 72 hours? A confirmed diplomatic breakthrough from the mediators already at the table, or a single verified event on the ground or on the water that turns today's speculation into tomorrow's headline? There's one more claim from the current information environment worth addressing directly, because it touches on the credibility of official statements from all sides, not just Iran's. Earlier in this war, American officials, including President Trump, characterized strikes on Iran as having eliminated or severely crippled Iran's air force, navy, armor, and air defense capability. The continued appearance of Iranian tanks, drone barrages, and ballistic missile launches months later does not necessarily mean those earlier statements were fabricated outright. Militaries frequently overstate the completeness of degradation strikes for both deterrence messaging and domestic political reasons, and partial destruction of a capability is often described publicly in far more total terms than the underlying battle damage assessment actually supports. What the continued Iranian strikes do verify is that whatever damage was inflicted in the war's opening days did not eliminate Iran's ability to conduct sustained retaliatory operations across multiple fronts for nearly 5 months, and counting. That is a meaningful, evidence-based correction to overly triumphant early claims without requiring you to conclude that those early claims were a deliberate lie rather than optimistic wartime messaging, a distinction this documentary thinks is worth preserving rather than collapsing into a simple "they lied" narrative, however satisfying that framing might feel. It's worth pausing on the human dimension of this as well, because six-figure oil price swings and radar damage assessments can obscure what daily life now looks like for people across the region. In Iran, year-on-year inflation approaching 90% means ordinary families are watching the price of basic goods climb on a weekly, sometimes daily basis, compounding the direct physical danger of nightly strikes with a slower, grinding economic crisis that will likely outlast any ceasefire. In Kuwait, Bahrain, and Qatar, residents who had for decades experienced their American military partnerships as a source of security and economic benefit are now living with the direct consequence of hosting that partnership. Air raid sirens, intercepted missiles overhead, and in at least one documented case in Kuwait, the death of a child from falling drone debris. And within Iran's own political class, the scenes from Ali Khamenei's funeral, mourners jeering at their own president, a senior diplomat fleeing an angry crowd, suggest a government managing not just an external war, but a genuine crisis of internal legitimacy, one where hardline domestic pressure may be pushing Tehran toward continued escalation, even if its military leadership privately recognizes the strategic costs of doing so. Let's also be precise about what would actually constitute confirmation of the most serious scenario discussed here, an Iranian ground invasion of Kuwait, because knowing what to watch for is more useful than reacting to any single alarming headline. Confirmation would look like one or more of the following, verified by multiple independent sources rather than a single social media account or state-aligned outlet. Satellite imagery showing sustained Iranian armor formations crossing the Iraq-Kuwait border region rather than repositioning within Iranian territory. An official statement from Kuwait's Ministry of Defense or the Emir's office describing an active incursion rather than an aerial strike, or corroborating reporting from U.S. Central Command acknowledging a ground engagement. Absent those specific markers, continued footage of tanks moving within Iran's own borders, however dramatic, remains evidence of posturing, repositioning, or preparation, all of which are worth tracking closely, but none of which should be reported as an invasion that has already begun.